In this lesson, we're going to take a look at key aspects of the United States Civil War, which was fought from 1861 to 1865. This map shows us the 11 southern states in gray that seceded or withdrew from the United States to form their own country, the Confederate States of America, otherwise known as the Confederacy. They felt that the federal government was no longer concerned about their needs and interests, which included slavery, so they also felt that they had the right to end their relationship with the United States. So they viewed this as much as a states' rights issue, that they had the right to end the Union, to break away from the United States. As far as President Lincoln was concerned, he refused to recognize the right of the Confederacy to exist. He never referred to them as the Confederacy. He always referred to them as the states in rebellion. And Lincoln was going to fight this war to keep the Union, all 38 states at the time, together as one country. This map here shows the battle strategy of both sides. So let's take a moment and look at the Union battle strategy in particular. Here the Union is laid out in pink and the Confederacy in blue. The Union battle strategy was a three-part strategy: to blockade southern ports, because the Union recognized that the South did not have the factories that the North had to make weapons and other war materials. Therefore, the Confederacy was going to need to purchase these war materials from overseas. Hence, blockading southern ports would prevent access to other markets for the goods that they needed. Additionally, the Union wanted to take control of the Mississippi River, which we see these arrows here in blue, which actually indicate they did take control. But the idea behind this was more of a divide and conquer strategy. The taking control of the Mississippi River would divide Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas on the western side of the Confederacy from the states in the eastern side of the Confederacy. And lastly, capture Richmond, Virginia, the third part of the Union strategy. Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia were not all that far apart from each other, about 90 miles or so. Richmond, Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy. So these three pieces were the Union strategy to get the Confederacy to surrender. The Confederate strategy was actually a simpler strategy. They were fighting a defensive war. They understood that if the Union wanted them back in the United States, they were going to have to come fight them and bring them back into the United States. So they needed to hunker down, fight a defensive war, and wear the Union down, meaning get the Northerners to the point after a bit of time that they were tired of fighting. And those Northerners then would pressure the president to simply allow the Confederacy to go, and the fighting would stop. I want to take a minute to point out 4 states here: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, that you see shaded in this blue-pink combination. Those were states in the Union, but slave states. Slavery was legal, and President Lincoln was very concerned that those states remain in the Union. So a lot of students tend to think that this war was fought to end slavery, and at the beginning of the war, that was certainly not the case, because if Lincoln freed the slaves, he knew those 4 states would immediately secede. What you are looking at is the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln issued in 1863, January 1863. And in fact, it said that the slaves were freed in the states in rebellion. The slaves in the border states were not freed as a result of this proclamation. In reality, no slaves were freed, in the sense that Southerners were not about to listen to anything that Lincoln had to say. They didn't view him as their president. So they were not about to tell their slaves that they could go walk off the plantation and go wherever. So slaves were not actually freed in the Confederate States until the Union Army began to move through those areas and make those slaves aware that they were now free. However, the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation is that ending slavery now became a goal of the war in addition to keeping the Union together. So those Northerners that were sitting on the sidelines, and there were many, that were unwilling to fight because the war was not about freeing the slaves, were now welcomed with open arms. For that matter, African Americans were now welcome to join the Union Army, whereas prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, they had not been allowed to join the Union Army. The Battle of Gettysburg, the turning point battle in the Civil War, July 1st through 3rd, 1864. This was a major Confederate loss. There were 160 some odd thousand people fighting in this three-day battle, combined Union and Confederate forces. There were 51,000 deaths in this battle, again, combined Union and Confederate forces. The key here is that the Confederacy had a much smaller population, so replacing these soldiers was going to be nearly impossible for the Confederacy to do, which was why the Union understood that this battle, winning this battle the way that they did, they knew that the war would eventually end. Because General Robert E. Lee was such a brilliant commander and the head of the Confederate forces, he managed to get the war using the resources that he had available, extend the war until April of 1865, which left the Union with the question how to speed up this war to get it to a conclusion. The answer that Ulysses S. Grant, the general in command of the Union Army, had is something called total war. To go down into the Confederacy and completely obliterate everything in the path of the Union Army. So you see here they're tearing up rail lines, burning down farms, whatever was in their way. Livestock was shot, crops were burned, and a major reason for this is that this started in Atlanta, and then the troops moved across Georgia to Savannah. This was known as Sherman's March to the Sea. This expedition, if you will, was led by William Tecumseh Sherman, General William Tecumseh Sherman. And that area in Georgia was the breadbasket of the colonies. So the idea was literally to starve the Confederate troops into surrender by destroying their food source. A hungry soldier is not a soldier that is going to fight. Once they reached the sea, they then turned north, headed towards Columbia, South Carolina. By the time they got into North Carolina, Lee had already surrendered to Grant. But I want to back up to this drawing here. You'll notice the slaves. And I mentioned a moment ago, as the Union troops went through the South, slaves began to gather and follow the troops because the troops were telling them that they were free. They no longer needed to stay on the plantations where they were. They certainly didn't want to, so they began to follow the soldiers. In April of 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant, and this officially ended the Civil War, which had been fought for 4 long years. The results of the war: 1. The Union was preserved. The United States would remain the United States. 2. Slavery was abolished. 3. About 500,000 people died. Remember, all the deaths in this case were American deaths, so we're counting deaths from both sides. And lastly, much of this war was fought in the South, and the South was destroyed. So then, To sum up, Lincoln fought the war to keep the Union together. The South fought the war to maintain their way of life, which of course included slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation turned this war into a crusade against slavery. So now you had a two-pronged focus of the war from the northern perspective, keeping the Union together, and then a year and a half into the war, now ending slavery. The North won, the Union was preserved, but the question of how to reintegrate the South back into economic and political life with the North was going to be the question that Abraham Lincoln was going to have to deal with in the period after the Civil War that we call Reconstruction. And that's coming up in the next series of lessons.